Most polar bears don't live in Oregon. Most aren't born in Ohio. Most don't survive being abandoned by their mothers when they're just a week old. But all of those things were true for Nora, a young polar bear who has had to deal with a number of challenges in her short life.
Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Oregonian readers were captivated by a series of stories called The Loneliest Polar Bear, or Project Nora. Editors describe it as a love story for Nora the polar bear who won our hearts at the Oregon Zoo. But the series is much more than a story about Nora. It also seeks to teach us something about ourselves and our purpose, the interconnection between polar bears and climate change, and raises important questions about zoos. The entire project took a year to complete. We're so pleased to have with us the lead reporter and photographer on the Loneliest Polar Bear Project, Project Nora, Cale Williams and Dale Killen. Thank you for joining us here on Straight Talk. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
First of all, let me just say that this was a beautiful story. Everyone in the newsroom was talking about it. Thank you, and congratulations on completing such a wonderful project.
Thank you.
The series captured so many hearts. It chronicled the life of Nora, who spent a year at the Oregon Zoo after being abandoned by her mother, Aurora, at the Columbus Zoo. Cale, I'll start with you. What motivated you to embark on this year-long adventure?
Instructions from my editor. I was covering the zoo. I was covering the elephants up there anytime they got a new animal or an animal passed away. And when Nora came, we realized that she had a pretty compelling backstory. She was raised by humans. We started doing a little bit of research and realized just how rare that is, how rare it is for a cub to survive. And so my editor, Mark Catches, came to me and said, this feels like it might have more to it. And so when we started doing our research, we looked into her lineage and where she came from the last time anyone in her line of descendants had been in the wild, and it turned out that her father was orphaned when his mother was killed by a hunter in Alaska. And when I went up there to interview him, that's when we kind of realized that all of these threads could be tied together.
Dave, what was all involved in telling this story? You guys went all over the place.
Yeah, well, first we went to Alaska, and another photographer at the paper, Stephanie Long, actually went with Cale to Columbus. Then we later went to Toledo, Ohio, and Salt Lake City finally was the last location. But yeah, we were kind of all over the place.
Well, tell us more about her backstory. You said that her father was orphaned up in Alaska, and then she ended up being born in the Columbus Zoo and then abandoned by her mother, Aurora. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so she was born on November 6th, 2015. And over the first 6 days of her life, her keepers told me that it was relatively normal. Her mother was with her in the den. Her mother, Aurora, would leave for short amounts of time, but she would always come back, so it wasn't really of great concern. But on the 6th day, her mother left and didn't come back. They waited about 4 hours, and when her vocalization started to get a little weaker, they got concerned because without her mother's warmth, without milk, they knew that she had to be getting cold and hungry. They told me it was an incredibly difficult decision. They knew how rare it was for these cubs to survive when they were hand-raised, but they made the decision to go in and pull her out of the den.
And they had to intervene and bottle feed, right? I mean, her odds of survival weren't great, were they, Dave?
Yeah, I think something like 80% of, is it cubs that they attempt to hand raise? Yeah. 80% that end up trying to be hand raised don't make it, so.
And how did she end up at the Oregon Zoo?
So after they raised her by hand for about 4 or 5 months, she got a little too big and had claws and teeth, so they could no longer be in with her, so she was kind of on her own. And they realized that there was no way for her to learn the ways of a polar bear than being with another polar bear. They couldn't put her back with her mother because she had already rejected her. Nora was too small. They were afraid that her mother could hurt her. And they knew that there was a bear here in Oregon that needed a companion. Tassel, who is very old for a polar bear.
31 years old,
31,
right?
Which is essentially geriatric for a polar bear, had been with her brother Conrad for years and years, but Conrad had died a couple months before. So they had this older bear who needed a companion, and they had this younger bear who needed to learn how to be a polar bear. And for all the other zoos in the country, this was the best fit for her.
But that, Dave, that didn't go as well as they hoped, did it, with Tassel?
It sounds like Nora was a little, it took her longer to get used to the idea of being with this much larger bear. She was, I think Tassel chased her a bit. It sounds like, by all accounts, Tassel was trying to be friendly, but Nora didn't know what to expect.
Something that we never heard until I read your article, that she developed some anxiety, and they had to put her on anxiety medication. Nora.
They did. So it started pretty soon after she got here. I mean, she was very attached to people, and I think that's one of the most compelling parts of the story, is that she at this point still probably doesn't really know she's a polar bear. She was raised by a group of 5 women. And so when she was left alone without humans around, she would throw tantrums. She would knock her food bowls around. She would pace, which is a issue of concern for animal behaviorists. And they got to the point where it wasn't getting any better, and it got worse with the stress of introductions to Tossel. So they originally put her on alprazolam, which is generic for Xanax, and then for a more long-term solution, they put her on Prozac.
And she ended up this fall, to the chagrin of many Oregon Zoo fans, being taken to the Salt Lake Zoo so that she could have more companionship with a polar bear named Hope. You raise a lot of questions about zoos in your series and whether they're exploitive. And when Nora was at the Columbus Zoo and they were hand feeding her, they did some video and took a lot of photos of that. And it was, well, they put it online and people went crazy for it. And you have a quote in one of your stories that you say, babies are currency for zoos and few animals are as rare or appealing or as valuable as a newborn polar bear. In the mid-90s, the Denver Zoo saw attendance double after 2 polar bear cubs were pulled from their mother. Family memberships went up by a third as zookeepers hand-raised Klondike and snow. The zoo raked in hundreds of thousands of dollars on merchandise from oven mitts to Christmas ornaments emblazoned with the likenesses of the cubs. If she lived, Nora would be good for the zoo's bottom line, and the marketing machine in Columbus was ready to make the most of her. But you also talk about some of the positives of zoos as well. Sure. What kind of reaction did you get from your readers?
I think that there were a lot of people who were happy to see an honest take that kind of laid out both sides. I got some emails from people who are members of the Zoo Foundation here, from some former zookeepers who were like, thank you for your honesty and your peace. I think that the issue is nuanced. I think that, you know, a zoo can be both marketing a small, very cute animal like this, while at the same time have that animal's best interests at heart.
You also talk about the polar bear's plight and how we're all connected to their survival. And you traveled, both of you, to the remote area in Alaska to trace Nora's lineage. You went with a wildlife biologist, Karen, who is a U.S. Geological Survey biologist from Portland. She tracks and studies polar bears. And in a new 30-minute documentary as part of your Project Nora, she talks about the receding polar ice. So let's talk about that after we listen to this clip from your documentary.
I've been working in the Chukchi Sea since 2008. Each spring we go out to capture bears between mid-March and the end of April. We capture about 75 bears a year. The objective of that work is to try to understand the status of the population, how healthy it is, but also try to understand how it's responding to sea ice loss. This year, we had unusual ice conditions. We know that this past March, which is supposed to be the time of year when there's more sea ice than any other time of the year, it was the least amount of ice that's ever occurred in March on record, in the satellite record since the 70s.
And Dave, how is that affecting the polar bear's survival?
What Karen told us was that with the decreasing ice, it means polar bears use sea ice as a platform from which to hunt seals. So as the ice shrinks, they have a harder time hunting, and so they eat less, and obviously that affects them negatively and makes it harder for them to have cubs.
Well, Cale, what is the polar bear's prognosis then with all of this?
Well, polar bears are not a monolith. There are 19 different subspecies that circle the North Pole, and some are doing better than others. Where Nora came from in the Chukchi Sea, they haven't seen a steep decline in body condition, but with the decline of sea ice that's forecast, Karen told us that over the long term that some of those species could go extinct.
And how is Nora doing now in the Utah Zoo, Dave? Do you know?
Well, we weren't able to see her when we actually went down to the Hogle Zoo, but from what we've heard and seen on their Facebook videos, she seems somewhat nervous. It's hard to tell, obviously, how she's actually feeling, but there hasn't been a ton of interaction between her and Hope. But we've heard that while Hope chased Nora, Nora also apparently chased Hope, which is a good sign. So it sounds like going about as well as could be expected from her.
Did you learn anything from doing this series for a year that surprised you?
A lot of things. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what was the most surprising thing.
You got a lot of access to the zoos too. I mean, you talk in your series about how zoos don't necessarily want people to see the bars and that kind of thing, but how did you guys get so much access?
Just spent a lot of time talking with zookeepers. I think that they realized that we were trying to provide a nuanced, accurate look at what they do. And while there may be parts of the zoo that the public doesn't necessarily see, the bars and the cages and stuff, I think that we built some trust with them over the year that we spent working on this.
What message do you hope, Dave, that people get from this series after they read all 5 parts?
I think hopefully the reality of climate change. Hopefully it chips away at the resistance that some people still have to accepting that this is a fact. It's not an opinion or something that's really up for debate.
I want to read a quote that was from near the last part of your series when you're talking about what is it going to take to save the polar bear, and you wrote, "They knew Nora's odds were long, and they had weighed those odds against the consequences of doing nothing. Their promise to Nora and to Bear 21736 was not that they always get it right, but that they try. They try because polar bears will die out unless people care enough to change. Making people care is what Nora does as well as any animal on Earth." Cale, do you have a final comment you'd like to leave our viewers with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that basically what zoos try to do is they want people to care about these animals so that they can translate that care into action. And essentially that's the same thing we were trying to do with this article, you know, with Nora as, you know, for lack of a better term, a vehicle. People will see this bear, they see that she needs help and realize that her wild counterparts need help as well.
Well, thank you both for being here. She's just so adorable as a cub bear and a beautiful bear now. Want to let you know how you can find The Loneliest Polar Bear, Project Nora, and the documentary. It's on OregonLive.com. We'll put links on KGW.com as well, so you can watch it there. Cale, Dave, thank you for joining us here on Straight Talk. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week for Straight Talk.
All right.